Hello, my darklings, lightlings, and all in between. How are you today? So, I wanted to dive into the mind and the workings of the father of the occult, the beast 666, the wickedest man of the world, Aleister Crowley. Yes. I do want to just say I may not agree with all of his choices or things that he had done. However, I do feel like he is a major symbol and influence in the occult world and a symbol of liberation. He really opened many doors for us in the occult, and he is iconic. So, let's dive into the mind and the workings of Aleister Crowley in his life. And if you are joining me again, thank you so much. And if you are new, please consider subscribing. We cover all kinds of neat topics on this channel. And do not forget that my book is now available on Amazon, ebook, and paperback. Destiny Bloodline Sagas. And thank you all who have been reading it and supporting my work. Your feedback and your support is much appreciated. Thank you. So Edward Alexander Crowley, well known as Aleister Crowley, was born in 1875 under wealthy Christian parents who ran a brewing company. It was during the height of the Victorian era. His entire childhood, his parents would constantly warn him of sin and temptation. They seemed to be religious extremists, in my opinion. His family were members of the Plymouth Brethren, which was a radical Protestant group. They strictly detested any form of self-pleasure or debauchery in any way or form, even described as pathological anti-pleasure extremists by some. Going by the belief of the literal truth of the Bible and focusing heavily on the book of Revelations. So this was kind of what was programmed and drilled into his mind from a young age. Crowley would travel with his father as he would go around Europe to preach. Some say Aleister aspired to be like his father, and he too had an ambition to follow in his footsteps. So what changed? His father died unexpectedly, shattering his world, and left him with his mother at 11 years of age. So his hero was inspiring him, then suddenly one day taken away from him. Crowley's sorrow turned into anger, causing him to resent his mother and the church and what they stood for. I imagine that he viewed the church differently during his grief. He began questioning the contradictions in the Bible and what he found to be a promised lie. His mother hired biblical tutors, which he came to resent. This was when his rebellious nature started to fuel his ambitions against religion, the church, and societal standards. He felt like the church made his childhood miserable. I had arrived at the conclusion that the Plymouth Brethren were an exceptionally detestable crew. This is a statement from Aleister Crowley's writings from his diary. It goes on to say, "I wanted sin, the supreme spiritual sin, but hadn't the slightest idea how to go about it." By these statements in his diaries alone, we can get a good idea about where his mindset was. When he became a teenager, he had the maid on his mother's bed as an act of revenge, pretty much to say, screw you, in his own way. He was turning into a person of revolt, and I can kind of understand it. Later, he was attending Cambridge University, but was expelled for catching gonorrhea from a prostitute. Now, these days, it would be a stupid reason to suspend someone from a university, right? But you have to understand that this was due to religion in the era that he lived in. Today, that would be his prerogative. But we can see these areas in his life where it seemed like if he refused to walk the religious line, he would reap negative backlash. Crowley decided then that he would free himself from his religious background and proceeded to publish poetry, which seemed to emulate his obsession with sex. I think it became an obsession because of his upbringing. Sex without marriage was forbidden and sinful. So what better way of rebelling than liberation of something that feels good? Crowley's poems were so sexual and graphic that he would have been charged and persecuted for obscenity if he did not publish his work abroad under a fake name. I am a fan of this poetry because there is a primitive truth and edges to it that I feel like we all deny to ourselves. But this was another way to spit at the Christian church in his eyes. Around this time at Cambridge, Crowley heard of secret societies that practiced dark magic and secrets of the occult. He was desperate to become part of that world. At the age of 21, a large trust fund was received, making him very wealthy. He chose to seek out the secret societies to become a black magician. After 2 years, he found what he was looking for. The Golden Dawn was an occult secret society with many prominent members like Bram Stoker or Yeats was involved, as well as many others. Crowley rapidly excelled up the ranks in this society. He did this like nobody else before, completely dominating his magical practice. It was as if he was made for the occult. He took it on so passionately, and he felt like he had found himself. He began to call himself the Beast 666. Later, Crowley became disappointed with the Golden Dawn, feeling like they were playing or dabbling around and did not push themselves beyond the limits in the occult. So he tried to usurp the leader. He even had issues with W.B. Yeats calling him a disheveled demonologist. He wanted more out of it. He wanted to push beyond his limits, and he started to perform some serious black magic rituals and rites. He bought a house in Scotland by Loch Ness to perform the Abramelin ritual that no magician dared to perform in centuries before Crowley's time. The Abramelin dates back to the 14th century, usually performed in 6 months of constant ritual to master demons. It was considered dangerous if control was lost. He was warned to not perform the ceremony, but he was determined to dive further into black magic. The idea of the ritual is to release these spirits and summon up a guardian angel. Reports of his experience during the ritual started getting around in the area, but nobody bothered Crowley. In fact, people would develop superstition and avoid going near the house. The house is still on Loch Ness today, but tragically, it is damaged by fire, but occultists from around the world are coming together to try to repair it, last that I heard. Crowley eventually halted the ritual, exhausted and living on bread and water, then getting up at the witching hour every night to perform evocations consistently. He grew weary, which a warning comes with this ritual. Once you begin it, you should never abandon it. So it was believed that Crowley was possibly possessed due to quitting this ritual. Soon after, Crowley met Rose Kelly and married her the day after they met, then took her to Egypt for their honeymoon. Crowley wrote in his diary about the debauchery he performed with Rose, claiming she was perfect in that of a wife and mistress. Crowley proceeded to take Rose to the pyramids, and he wanted to show his new wife how powerful of a magician he was. Crowley brought candles and his notebook into the king's chamber, where he would perform a preliminary invocation in the Goetia. Something unexpected happened to change Crowley's life. He states, "Something happened to Rose's state of mind. I never seen anything like it before. She kept on repeating, dreamily yet intensely, 'They are waiting for you. They are waiting for you.' It seemed to have been channeled. When Crowley asked her who was waiting, she replied, 'Horus, a Egyptian deity.' Crowley was irritated by her bizarre behavior. She knew nothing about magic and less about the Egyptian pantheon, so he assumed she would not be the one to receive messages from the gods. So he took Rose to an Egyptian museum in Cairo, which she had never been to before, to test her about the message. To his amazement, Rose passed through many artifacts until she stopped dead in front of Horus, or an image of him she had channeled in the pyramids. Crowley wanted to know what it all meant. Rose told him they had to go back to the hotel and wait to see. The exhibit that Rose stopped in front of was also marked as Exhibit 666. During this point of his life, now with more open doors to a new power that stuck with him, some believe he had given himself fully under demonic control. He welcomed the influence to be the vessel in which they could control. This is the opinion of Doug Harris in the Masters of Darkness documentary. Doug says he believed Crowley was the real deal. Crowley was now about to receive a revelation that made him a prophet of a new religion, which dedicated his life to sex and magic. He believed that one must harness darkness as well as light to master the occult. He performed many dark rituals to attempt to harness his goals, but he never successfully came face to face with a demon. Until years later, he finally got what he was looking for. He heard a voice from over his left shoulder in a hotel room. For 1 hour over the next 3 days, he was communicating with the demon. Crowley said that the voice dictated to him the Book of the Law, the channeled work that became the new Bible of his religion. Basically, the intent here was to shed all holy books, the Bible, the Quran, all of them, to start a clean slate. He purposely made it as blasphemous as possible to symbolize his liberation in his newfound religion. It is about having no restrictions at all and following your own path above all else. He proclaimed himself as a medium for a higher force to adapt this in his new religion. The number 1 law of the book states, "Do what thou wilt." He believed that people have a right to determine their own way to think and live, regardless of moral or religious boundaries. A year later, he set off to conquer the world's largest mountains. He had been climbing since he was a teenager. In this major expedition, he was judged harshly for leaving behind the group members. After an argument, when he decided to remove himself from the group, an avalanche emerged and swept over the descending group members that he left. It was said that Crowley ignored their cries for help and sipped tea in his tent unbothered. Savage. But the 4 men ended up dying from that avalanche. After that, Crowley set off to China with his wife Rose and his daughter. Reaching China, he began to partake in sex with a mistress in Shanghai. Rose was unable to cope on her own, and their daughter died of typhoid. Crowley deserted Rose for good, blaming her for the death of their child, which I do want to say that I found statistically that if a couple loses a child, it's actually quite common that they split up and blame through their grief. That's just sad. In her despair, Rose went mad. Crowley went back to England and met his first disciple, Victor Neuburg, a young poet. Victor was actually in love with Crowley. Some say Crowley saw him as a weak character and drug him into his occult business. But in my opinion, with that is, Victor had free will. He followed and consented to what Crowley was about. By that time, everybody knew Crowley and what he was about. Victor and Crowley set out into Algeria to perform a ritual. It was said that Victor was subjected to a lot to test his devotion. Their intent in the desert was to perform Enochian dark magic. They walked deep into the Sahara for 2 days. In my opinion, the documentary did not fully understand the occult references or significance about this. 1, the desert is known to be where demonic entities dwell. 2, they took mind-altering drugs, which is known to expand consciousness, and I am not condoning or recommending drug use. 3, their intent was to summon the source of darkness, or the devil. They were attempting to open the infernal gates and create a portal, in my opinion, and in others as well. Zazaz, zazaz, nasata, zazaz, were the starting words of his incantation, which was literally to open the gates of hell. Crowley was daring, and it is said that even though he drew circles during his rituals, he would stand outside of the circle to push those limits. He wanted to be the funnel to bring otherworldly spirits into our world. Most magicians would say that what he did is dangerous. You can go mad, with voices and other symptoms. But Crowley soaked it in, embraced it, and worked with it. During the ritual, Crowley performed a sex act with Victor, and at the point of orgasm, he received a revelation. A blinding white light that began to communicate with him, which taught him that sex could be a sacrament in praise of the gods, like a shortcut to go straight to what is magically that you want to achieve. The effects of the ritual left Victor shattered. He never fully recovered from the experience. But for Crowley, that was the final piece of the puzzle he needed to solve in his own practice. He united sex with magic. He began to keep detailed records of his exploits and started the practice of sex magic. He moved to New York, and when the Cold War broke out, he offered himself to Britain as a spy. He was rejected, so he then sided with the Germans. Well, that is debated as well, because he began to write German-related propaganda in the most absurd ways possible so that they would be viewed ridiculous to the U.S. So he did write some awful crazy stuff during that time, but if his intent was, in fact, to make them look bad to the rest of the world, I mean, I'll leave that for you to decide. Britain saw him as a traitor, and Crowley went to establish his religion that he called Thelema. He returned to Europe, avoiding Britain, and became established in Sicily to buy a house to create his own temple. He called it the Abbey of Thelema. He hoped that this would be the beginning of his religion. He established the house in 1920 with a mistress, a newborn baby, and followers from around the world. His mistress was from New York and 19 years old. Her name was Leah, and she was devoted to Crowley and his work. The followers, along with Crowley, would partake in hashish, opium, and sex magic rituals. The intent was for them to perform magic and discover their will. They even had a dog named Satan. Basically, they became a Thelema cult. It is said that the house is cursed to this day. Things began to fall apart as Crowley struggled with his drug addiction. He had a member that moved to the Abbey with his wife. He wrote to his parents saying he was the happiest he had ever been, but later, after performing a sacrifice on a cat, he died from drinking the blood. His wife went back to Britain and told journalists about the Abbey and Crowley's work. The tabloids depicted his group and Crowley as dark satanic people performing orgies and sacrifice and such, which resulted in them being kicked out. Crowley went off on his own. Leah turned to prostitution. Most of the followers went mad and one committed suicide. His dream was over and was now public enemy as the wickedest man in the world. In the end, he was alone, struggling with his addiction and living in a boarding house. A woman named Deidre McClellan approached Aleister and asked to have a son, that he would be magical, and Crowley agreed. They performed a sex ritual and she did have his son. Crowley loved him and wanted a good future for little Aleister. In his diary, Aleister began questioning what his life had amounted to. Deidre says, when Aleister died, the curtains in the room flung violently and thunder boomed. She says she believes it was the gods greeting him. Aleister died in 1947. Before he wrote a prophecy that he started mankind on ultimate liberation, the symbol of rebellion. People thought his ideas died with him until the free love era began to rise, along with New Age beliefs and other ideals, which was the start of his prophecy to mankind. He stated that we would seek for ourselves. We would rebel against oppression and reach liberation. Looking at the rise of witchcraft and activism and occultism is prominent now, and has been rising for years as people began creating their own ideas over the passing eras. It is safe to say that I do not always agree with all of Crowley's actions, but I admire his intellect, his rebellion, and his wisdom from his experience. The first to truly rise to the idea of our own spiritual liberation. His ideas are still practiced and elaborated on to date. He was a 60s icon, and many famous bands and people followed in his footsteps. Since the 60s, the occult has risen, and we continue to embrace his ideas of spiritual enlightenment and sex magic and other forms of ritual or ceremonial magic. Was Crowley really wicked? Or was he a victim of his fight against his upbringing and religion? Or was he a true father and prophet of occultism? He was selfish, cruel in some ways, childish and extreme, but he was a mystic and determined spirit who was fearless in contributing to the occult world. We cannot deny that. He lived an interesting life. Alrighty guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know, because I can go on and on with a lot more pertaining to Aleister Crowley if this interests you. Much love, always.